My name is Rebecca, 30 years old, and I used to think the ultimate betrayal was a sudden explosive event. I learned the hard way that it actually happens in the dead of night, disguised as annoyance. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, a blinding tearing pain ripped through my abdomen, followed by a warm rush of fluid that soaked the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets of our Chicago penthouse. Blood. It was too early. I was terrified. I frantically shook my husband Dominic, whose back was turned to me. I could barely speak through the agony, gasping that something was wrong, that the babies were coming. I did not mention twins aloud in my panic, only that the pain was unbearable. Dominic did not spring into action. He did not ask if I was okay. Instead, he violently yanked his arm away from my grasp and pulled the heavy duvet over his head. "I have a pivotal venture capital meeting in the morning for my tech startup," he groaned, his voice dripping with irritation. "I need my sleep, Rebecca. Just call an Uber." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your heart broken by the one person who swore to protect you. I stared at his silhouette in the dark, the pain in my body momentarily eclipsed by the sheer icy shock of his words. He was not joking. My husband of 4 years was annoyed that my medical emergency was interrupting his sleep schedule. Every breath felt like swallowing shattered glass as I dragged myself out of bed. I did not scream or beg. A terrifying survival instinct kicked in, overriding the shock of his coldness. Leaving Dominic snoring in our bed, I managed to pull on a heavy winter coat over my blood-stained pajamas, grabbed my car keys, and crawled my way to the elevator. I could not wait for a rideshare. Every second felt like slipping closer to the edge of a dark cliff. The Chicago winter was brutal that night. I staggered into the freezing garage and forced myself behind the wheel of my car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of blinding snow, agonizing contractions, and sheer terror. The roads were completely iced over the windshield wipers, struggling to fight away the heavy flakes. The heater blasted, but I was shivering uncontrollably, my vision blurring at the edges as a terrible pressure built behind my eyes. The freezing wind howled outside my window, matching the panicked rhythm of my heart. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock, the bright green numbers glaring back at me, a constant reminder of how long I had been fighting this battle alone. I thought about the man sleeping peacefully in our warm bed, completely unbothered by the fact that his wife was navigating black ice and blinding flurries while suffering from what felt like her body tearing itself apart. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional realization that I was entirely on my own was a different kind of agony. It was a sharp, clarifying pain that cut through the fog of my panic. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white, whispering prayers into the empty, freezing air of the car. I dialed Dominic number twice on the Bluetooth speaker. Both times it went straight to voicemail. He had turned his phone off. He had completely shut me out while I was bleeding and fighting to stay conscious on the slippery winter roads. Upon arriving at the emergency room drop-off, I could barely stand. Nurses rushed out with a wheelchair the moment they saw the state I was in. From there, everything spiraled into medical chaos. The bright fluorescent lights of the trauma bay blinded me. Alarms blared from monitors. Doctors shouted commands over each other. My blood pressure had spiked to a lethal level. Severe preeclampsia, the attending physician yelled, telling the team to prep an operating room immediately. I remember a nurse holding my hand, her eyes filled with pity as she asked where my husband was. I could not answer. The heavy pain medication pulled me into a suffocating darkness, and I was rushed into an emergency cesarean section, terrified that neither I nor my children would wake up. I survived. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh reality of the maternity ward greeted me. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor were my only companions. My body felt as though it had been sawed in half, the surgical incision burning with every shallow breath I took. The nurses eventually brought my babies to me, placing their tiny, fragile bodies carefully on my chest. Looking down at them, a fierce protective fire ignited in my soul. They were early small, but fighting with an incredible strength. But alongside that overwhelming love was a gaping, echoing void in the room. For 72 agonizing hours I lay in that hospital bed. 3 full days and nights of nurses bustling in and out, checking my vitals, helping me feed the newborns, and casting sympathetic glances toward the empty visitor chair in the corner of my room. Other women in the ward had their partners sleeping on uncomfortable folding cots, bringing them flowers, holding their hands, and crying tears of joy over their new families. I had my phone sitting silently on the tray table. No texts, no missed calls, no frantic voicemails from a husband wondering where his pregnant wife had gone in the middle of the night. Dominic had simply woken up, seen I was gone, and went to his pitch meeting. The nurses would come in to check my stitches, offering soft smiles and gentle words of encouragement, but their kindness only highlighted the glaring absence of my husband. I watched the snow continue to fall outside my hospital window, piling up on the city streets below, and I realized that my marriage had been just as cold and barren. I thought about how many times I had excused his late nights, his dismissive comments, his blatant disregard for my feelings, all in the name of his ambition. I had supported his dreams while he could not even be bothered to support me through childbirth. As I held my son and daughter close to my chest, feeling their tiny heartbeats against my own, I made a silent promise to them. I would never let them feel the neglect that their father had so easily inflicted upon me. The silence from him was not just an absence of communication. It was a loud, undeniable declaration of my worth to him. I spent those first 2 days crying quietly when the nurses left the room. I mourned the marriage I thought I had. I mourned the father I thought my children would have. I thought about the months leading up to this moment, how he had always been too busy with his startup to attend a single ultrasound appointment, how he had brushed off my attempts to discuss the nursery, how he had never even bothered to look at the medical files I left on the kitchen counter. He had been completely checked out of my pregnancy, viewing it as an inconvenience rather than a miracle. But by the 3rd day, the tears stopped falling. They dried up, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that the man I married did not care if I lived or died in that snowstorm. He did not care about the physical trauma my body had just endured. He only cared about his ambition, his sleep, and his comfort. The sadness turned into something much harder, something unbreakable. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the heavy wooden door of my hospital room finally swung open. Dominic sauntered in. He was not rushing. He was not breathless with worry or pale with regret. The sharp click of his expensive leather shoes echoed against the linoleum floor. He was dressed in a pristine, custom-tailored navy suit, looking like he had just stepped out of a luxury magazine shoot. But before he even spoke, a scent hit me. Underneath his expensive designer cologne was the lingering, undeniable smell of a high-end women perfume. It was a sweet, cloying fragrance I had never worn in my life. The betrayal layered upon betrayal settled over me, but I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my pain. He stood at the foot of my hospital bed, his hands shoved deeply into his pockets, his face twisted in a scowl of disgust as he looked around the clinical environment, taking in the IV bags and medical equipment as if they personally offended his aesthetic sensibilities. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask about the traumatic surgery that had nearly cost me my life. He did not ask if the delivery went well or if there were complications. Instead, he reached into his sleek leather briefcase and casually tossed a single piece of paper onto my tray table. It landed right next to my untouched hospital lunch. I looked down at the document. It was a formal request for a paternity test. I need to see my child before I sign any financial paperwork for this hospital bill, he demanded, his voice flat and entirely businesslike. I am not paying for a delivery if I am not convinced the kid is mine. The absolute audacity of his demand hung in the sterile air of the room. He stood there exuding arrogant confidence, entirely expecting me to crumble into a weeping, defensive mess. Throughout my pregnancy, Dominic had never attended a single doctor visit. He claimed he was too busy launching his groundbreaking technology startup to sit in a waiting room. He had never even bothered to read the medical files I brought home. He thought I was just a weak, exhausted woman who would beg for his financial support, beg for his presence, and cry over his cruel accusations. He assumed my silence over the past 3 days was born of fear and desperation. He was terribly catastrophically wrong. I looked at the paternity test form, tracing the crisp black ink with my eyes, then looked up at the man I had given 4 years of my life to. All the remaining love I held for him evaporated in that exact second, leaving nothing behind but absolute chilling composure. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not cry to defend my honor against his baseless cheating allegations. I gave him a slow, cold smile that made his smug expression falter just a fraction. I leaned back against the harsh hospital pillows, ignoring the searing pain in my healing abdomen, and folded my hands gracefully over my lap. "Which one?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet and perfectly steady. Dominic blinked, clearly annoyed by my response, his brow furrowing as he tried to process my incredibly calm demeanor. "What are you talking about?" he snapped impatiently, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I kept my eyes locked onto his, refusing to look away, letting the heavy silence stretch for a perfectly calculated moment before delivering the final blow. "I asked which child you want to see, Dominic," I said, watching his chest rise and fall. "The son you had no idea I was carrying, or the daughter you will now be paying child support for until she turns 18. The color completely drained from Dominic's face in an instant. His jaw went slack, his arrogant posture crumbling as the realization struck him like a heavy physical blow. He had completely ignored my pregnancy, ignored my changing body, ignored the detailed medical files sitting in plain sight on our kitchen counter, and ignored me when I was bleeding in our bed. And now, as he stood there holding his ridiculous paternity test paperwork, trying to intimidate me to avoid hospital bills, he realized he had 2 children. 2 beautiful children he would be legally bound to, and a wife who was looking at him not with the adoration he expected, but with the cold, calculating eyes of an adversary who had just declared absolute war. The silence in my recovery room lasted exactly 10 seconds before the heavy door swung open and slammed against the wall. Patricia and Brittany marched inside, bringing a wave of expensive perfume and unyielding hostility. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had clearly bypassed the front desk security. Patricia wore her signature cashmere coat, her face contorted in absolute fury. Brittany trailed right behind her, holding a designer handbag like a weapon. They had come for a fight. Patricia did not ask how I was feeling. She did not look at the 2 bassinets resting quietly beside my bed. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face and accused me of orchestrating a malicious trap. She shrieked that I had intentionally hidden the twin pregnancy from Dominic to extort their family for a much larger financial payout, acting as if I had carefully orchestrated this entire situation from the very beginning. According to Patricia, I was nothing more than a calculating gold digger trying to secure a permanent paycheck. Brittany sneered and enthusiastically echoed every cruel word her mother said, crossing her arms and looking down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust, as if my mere presence offended her. They stood there in their expensive clothes, completely convinced that they held all the power in the room. I listened to their absurd accusations without blinking. The physical pain from my emergency surgery was throbbing, but it felt entirely secondary to the cold rage building in my chest. They actually believed I had endured a near-fatal snowstorm and a terrifying emergency delivery just to trap a man who could not even be bothered to answer his phone. Patricia took a step closer to my bed, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper as she outlined her ruthless plan. She proudly declared that their family possessed the wealth to hire the most aggressive attorneys in the city. She looked at the blue blanket in the first bassinet and announced they would seek full legal custody of my son. He was going to carry their family name, she insisted, and they would not allow a common office worker to raise their heir. Then she glanced at the pink blanket in the second bassinet and let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. She told me I could keep the girl. "Girls are far too expensive to raise and simply require too much effort," she stated with a straight face. The sheer monstrous cruelty of her words hung heavily in the sterile hospital air. A grandmother was casually plotting to separate newborn twins, leaving one behind like discarded luggage, while ripping the other away from his mother. Brittany nodded in agreement, adding that Dominic needed a son to continue his legacy, but certainly did not need the financial burden of a daughter. They were speaking about my children as if they were inventory to be sorted and discarded at their convenience. I tightened my grip on the edge of the bed sheets, keeping my face completely blank. I knew that showing any emotion would only feed their twisted sense of superiority. They wanted me to beg. They fully expected me to cry and plead for them to somehow keep my family together, acting as though I were completely powerless without them. I refused to give them a single tear. Dominic, who had been standing silently by the hospital room window, suddenly seemed immensely emboldened by his mother and sister joining the ruthless attack. He walked over to my bed, picking up the momentum they had created. He reached into his leather briefcase again and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He threw them onto my lap, the heavy paper landing awkwardly across my healing incision. He ordered me to sign over the deed to my premarital home. He declared that he needed the equity from my house to fund the next development phase of his technology startup. He stood directly over me, attempting to look physically imposing, and arrogantly revealed that he had found a real woman who actually supported his lofty ambitions without ever complaining. He proudly stated that Cameron was a visionary partner who understood the demands of a tech founder, unlike me. He spoke about his mistress with a sickening pride, completely disregarding the fact that his wife had just survived a major medical trauma to deliver his children. Dominic believed his timing was flawless. He calculated that I was weak, heavily medicated, and sufficiently terrified by his mother threatening to take my son. He assumed that a low-level desk worker like me would simply cave to his demands out of sheer panic and desperation. He thought I would sign away the only asset I had left, just to keep the peace and protect my babies. He demanded I find a pen and sign the transfer documents, immediately promising that if I complied, he would convince his mother to let me see my son on weekends. The arrogance radiating from him was palpable. He genuinely believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. I looked down at the dense legal jargon printed on the pages resting on my lap. The documents were hastily drafted, likely prepared by some cheap attorney he had hired in secret. He wanted to take my home, my savings, and my only son, leaving me with absolutely nothing. As Dominic continued his aggressive demands, the hospital room door opened quietly again. Terrence walked into the room. He was Brittany's husband, an exceptionally sharp and meticulous forensic accountant who always possessed a remarkably quiet yet deeply commanding presence. As an African-American man marrying into this deeply entitled family, Terrence was constantly subjected to their subtle racism and blatant classism. Patricia frequently made passive-aggressive remarks about his background, and Dominic treated him like the hired help rather than a brother-in-law. Terrence endured it all with a calm, stoic demeanor that I had always respected. He stepped into the room and immediately noticed the hostile dynamic. He immediately saw the ridiculous legal papers scattered across my bed, and the deeply furious expressions permanently etched on the faces of his in-laws. Instead of joining their unhinged attack, he quietly hung back near the doorway, his dark eyes carefully scanning the room with intense, analytical precision, assessing every single detail. Patricia suddenly clapped her hands together, completely ignoring Terrence, and instructed Dominic to pick up the baby boy. She loudly announced that they needed to take a family photo for social media to welcome the new heir. Dominic eagerly scooped my son out of the bassinet. The three of them marched out into the brightly lit hospital hallway to find the perfect lighting, leaving the baby girl completely ignored in the room. Their desperate need for validation and public attention blinded them to everything else. They left the door cracked open, and I could hear them laughing and posing for the camera, celebrating their genetic legacy while plotting to leave me destitute. They were so consumed by their own vanity they completely forgot about the quiet accountant standing in the shadows of my hospital room. The moment they were out of sight, Terrence moved quickly. He crossed the room and stood right beside my bed, glancing back at the hallway to ensure they were entirely distracted. His usual stoic expression was gone, replaced by a fierce, urgent intensity. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. He slipped it directly into my palm, his fingers cold and steady. He leaned down and whispered so quietly that only I could hear. Dominic is not just cheating on you, Rebecca. He has been busy. The USB felt heavy in my hand. Terrence revealed that he had been secretly auditing Dominic business accounts after noticing massive red flags during a family dinner a few weeks ago. He uncovered that Dominic had illegally forged my signature to take out massive secondary mortgages on my property. He had leveraged my home to the absolute brink, using the stolen funds to keep his failing company afloat and to finance a lavish lifestyle for Cameron. Dominic was drowning in toxic debt, and he was planning to let the banks foreclose on my house, leaving me to face the financial ruin while he walked away clean. Terrence looked me dead in the eye and urged me to use the data on the drive. He told me to burn them to the ground. He stepped back quickly, just as Patricia laughed loudly out in the hallway. I closed my fist tightly around the small metal drive, securely hiding it beneath my thin hospital blanket, ensuring no one else saw. The fear that had gripped me during the snowstorm vanished entirely, replaced by a lethal, absolute focus. I reached over to the bedside table and grabbed my phone. I completely bypassed the nurse call button and immediately dialed the direct line for my corporate attorney. The private medical transport pulled up to the curb of my Chicago townhouse 4 days later. My corporate attorney had swiftly drafted protective legal barriers operating behind the scenes to shield my liquid assets. The slushy, freezing rain reflected the gray afternoon sky. I tipped the driver as he helped me carry the 2 infant carriers up the front steps of my home. My abdomen still burned with a dull, agonizing ache from the surgery, but my mind was operating with absolute strategic precision. I shifted my weight to balance the carriers and slid my key into the heavy oak door. It did not turn. I tried again, thinking the cold had jammed the mechanism, but the metal cylinder was completely different. The locks had been changed. I took a step back and peered through the large bay window. The sight inside was comical. Black trash bags were piled haphazardly in the foyer, spilling over with my winter coats and personal items. Beyond them, I could see the living room. Sitting on my custom velvet sofa was a woman I immediately recognized from Dominic's social media feeds. Cameron. She was lounging comfortably, wearing one of my expensive cashmere sweaters, holding a glass of imported wine, and scrolling carelessly through her phone. The sheer entitlement radiating from her posture made my blood run cold. She believed she could simply move into my house while I recovered from surgery. I did not pound on the glass or drop the bassinets and start screaming for the neighbors. I reached into my diaper bag, pulled out my phone, and dialed the police. I calmly explained that I had returned from the maternity ward to find unauthorized individuals occupying my property and that they had illegally changed the locks. I informed them I was standing on the porch with 2 newborn infants in the freezing rain. 2 patrol cars arrived within 8 minutes with their lights flashing against the gray, affluent neighborhood. The officers stepped out of their vehicles as they approached. I handed the lead officer my pristine folder containing my unassailable premarital property deeds, tax receipts, and current photo identification. I bought this house entirely with my own money before I met Dominic, and my name was the only one on the mortgage. The officers looked at the stamped legal documents and approached the front door, pounding heavily on the wood, demanding entry. Dominic opened the door with a smug expression that instantly evaporated the second he saw the uniforms. The officers did not waste a second listening to his stammered explanations about marital disputes. They ordered him and Cameron to vacate the premises immediately or face severe trespassing charges. Cameron scrambled out of the house, her face flushed bright red with sheer panic. She stumbled down the porch steps as the freezing rain soaked her styled hair. Dominic followed right behind her, shivering violently, his face contorted in absolute red-faced rage. He stood on the slippery sidewalk, pointing a violently shaking finger at me while the officers escorted me safely inside. He screamed that I was making a catastrophic mistake and promised he would drag me through the courts, taking absolutely everything in the divorce, leaving me completely penniless. I just closed the heavy oak door, locking the deadbolt, shutting out his pathetic threats entirely. Once the house was secured, I carried the twins upstairs to the nursery. I fed them, changed them, and watched them fall into a deep, peaceful sleep in their cribs. The house was finally quiet. I walked into my expansive home office, firmly locking the heavy oak door behind me. I sat down in my leather chair, adjusting the height to accommodate my healing surgical wound, and hit the power button on my massive multi-monitor workstation. The six ultra-high-definition screens flickered to life, sequentially casting a bright blue clinical glow across the dark room. My dedicated secure servers hummed to life, instantly syncing with the global financial markets. I quickly verified that the preliminary injunctions my legal team filed were silently weaving their way through the civil court system undetected. Dominic and his entire entitled family firmly believed I was just a mid-level desk worker pushing papers for a boring logistics company. They thought my income was modest, and my professional network was non-existent. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never bothered to actually understand what I did for a living. I was not a mid-level analyst. I was a ruthless senior director of mergers and acquisitions at one of the most aggressive high-stakes investment firms on Wall Street. I specialized in hostile takeovers, corporate liquidations, and dismantling failing companies for parts. I managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars and controlled a vast network of corporate attorneys, hedge fund managers, and financial fixers. I had spent the last decade tearing apart multi-billion-dollar corporations, finding their hidden weaknesses and ruthlessly exploiting them for maximum profit. I commanded a team of 30 elite financial analysts who could dismantle a company valuation in hours. Dominic thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a defenseless, naive housewife. He had no idea he had just blindly declared war on a corporate apex predator with limitless resources at her immediate disposal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted USB drive that Terrence had slipped into my hand at the hospital. I plugged it into my secure workstation and entered the decryption key Terrence had texted to my private number. The files decrypted and opened, revealing an intricately detailed map of Dominic's entire fraudulent financial existence. Terrence was a brilliantly observant forensic accountant, and his meticulous documentation proved he had missed nothing. Every single spreadsheet was cross-referenced with bank routing numbers and time-stamped transaction logs. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting the raw data with cold surgical precision. I mapped out the exact web of forged secondary loans Dominic had illegally secured using my property deed as collateral. I traced the hidden offshore bank accounts he was actively using to funnel stolen money away from his struggling startup. I saw the receipts for Cameron luxury lifestyle, the expensive dinners, the designer handbags, the lavish hotel stays, all paid for with funds he had fraudulently stolen under my name. The financial state of his company was fragile. He was burning through cash at an alarming rate, desperately trying to keep the facade of success alive, just long enough to secure his next round of venture capital funding. If his investors saw even a fraction of the criminal financial liability buried in these files, they would run for the hills. But exposing his fraud was simply not enough for me. I wanted to completely eradicate his entire professional existence. I dug deeper into his operational files, analyzing the core structure of the technology he was attempting to sell. That is when I found the fatal flaw. Dominic had been boasting for months about his groundbreaking proprietary algorithm, claiming it was a completely original piece of code that would revolutionize the industry. He had built his entire investor pitch around this singular technological asset. But internal contracts buried deep within his server told a completely different story. The algorithm was not proprietary at all. He did not build it, and he certainly did not own it. He was merely licensing the core code from an obscure tech firm based out of Silicon Valley. The licensing agreement had a highly specific vulnerability written into Clause 7 stating ownership could transfer upon a corporate buyout. I ran a rapid financial background check on that specific firm using my corporate database. The results made a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. The firm was completely bankrupt. They were currently drowning in massive corporate debt, facing imminent commercial foreclosure, and desperately liquidating their remaining assets to avoid total collapse. Dominic's entire multi-million-dollar empire was built on a fragile rented foundation owned by a dying company. I picked up my phone. It was past midnight, but in my line of work, money never sleeps. I made 3 highly confidential phone calls to my senior investment partners in New York. I outlined a rapid aggressive acquisition strategy. I instructed my team to initiate a hostile corporate buyout of that bankrupt firm immediately using our firm's expansive emergency acquisition fund. I detailed the maximum purchase price and the exact legal maneuvers required to bypass standard waiting periods, ensuring the deal would be finalized before dawn. By purchasing the dying company, my investment fund would legally absorb all of their remaining assets, including the exclusive intellectual property rights to the algorithm Dominic was actively using. I hung up the phone, staring at the glowing data streams reflecting in my dark office. Dominic was preparing to walk into a room full of powerful investors to sell a company he genuinely thought he controlled. He had absolutely no idea that by the time the sun came up, I would literally own the ground he was standing on. The next 48 hours were an absolute masterclass in aggressive financial warfare. Operating entirely behind the locked doors of my home office, while my newborn twins slept peacefully in their nursery, I unleashed the full devastating weight of my investment firm. The target was a crumbling tech company nestled in the heart of Silicon Valley, holding the sole intellectual property rights to the algorithm Dominic claimed as his own original creation. They were bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate, facing immediate commercial foreclosure and desperate for a financial lifeline to keep their doors open. My acquisition team did not offer them a lifeline. We offered a swift, brutal buyout that left absolutely no room for counteroffers or negotiation. Through a series of rapid legal maneuvers, offshore wire transfers, and aggressive boardroom tactics executed across different time zones, we systematically bypassed the standard corporate waiting periods. I maintained absolute secrecy throughout the entire hostile takeover, ensuring no market indicators would tip off Dominic or his associates. I watched the financial data stream across my 6 ultra-high-definition monitors, as the final signatures were electronically verified and authenticated by our legal department. By Tuesday morning, the digital ink was dry. My firm had fully absorbed the bankrupt entity, swallowed its remaining capital, and stripped it entirely for parts. I was now the absolute legal owner of the exact lines of code that kept Dominic highly touted startup breathing. I held the keys to his entire professional existence securely in my hands, holding the power to terminate his business with a single keystroke. Completely oblivious to the fact that his corporate foundation had just been vaporized from thousands of miles away, Dominic was busy living out a massive delusion of grandeur. He and Cameron had taken up permanent residence in one of the most expensive luxury hotels in downtown Chicago, treating the premium suite like their own personal palace. He was funding this lavish lifestyle using the last remnants of the fraudulent secondary mortgages he had illegally taken out, using my property deed as collateral. He was burning through stolen cash at an alarming rate, booking top-tier spa treatments, ordering ridiculously expensive room service, and outfitting his mistress in designer clothing so she could play the role of the successful tech founder, supportive partner. He genuinely believed he had won the ultimate victory. To solidify his perceived dominance, he arranged a celebratory dinner at a high-end steakhouse with Patricia and Brittany. Through the detailed financial tracking Terrence had secretly provided me, I could see the exact exorbitant charges hitting the credit accounts in real time. They were toasting to his upcoming Series A funding round, completely convinced that his highly anticipated investor pitch would yield an easy $20 million in clean venture capital. Patricia and Brittany undoubtedly spent the entire evening feeding his massive ego, praising his business acumen, and mocking the wife he had so casually discarded in a hospital room. They celebrated the fact that they had successfully locked me out in the cold, assuming I was currently drowning in the massive debt he had forged under my name. They thought I was a helpless, naive woman desperately trying to figure out how to pay for 2 infants on a modest clerical salary while they drank imported champagne on my dime, reveling in their shared toxic delusion. Their profound arrogance crystallized 2 days later when a bonded courier knocked loudly on my front door. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope from a highly aggressive and notoriously expensive family law firm located in the financial district. I carried the envelope into my kitchen, poured myself a cup of dark black coffee, and spread the documents across the granite island to review them. It was a formal legal notice of divorce, and the demands written on those pages were nothing short of spectacular in their delusion. Dominic, high-priced attorney, had drafted a ruthless petition claiming that since I was allegedly the primary earner with my stable corporate office job, I should be legally compelled to pay him exorbitant spousal support. The document explicitly stated he required this constant financial assistance to maintain his current luxury standard of living while he dedicated his valuable time to building his revolutionary startup. Worse, they officially reiterated Patricia's cruel threat regarding the children. The legal petition formally requested full physical and legal custody of my newborn son, completely ignoring the existence of my daughter, framing the boy as a vital piece of the family legacy that needed to be protected from a financially unstable mother. The paperwork specifically argued that my modest income was insufficient to provide for a male heir. They were attempting to weaponize the legal system to strip me of my remaining assets and physically tear my family apart, using the very money he had stolen from me to pay the massive retainer fee for this aggressive legal representation. A lesser woman might have panicked at the sight of those official court stamps and ruthless demands. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee and calmly filed the entire stack of paperwork into my shredder pile. I had absolutely no intention of engaging in a pathetic back-and-forth battle in family court, where he could play the victim and drag the process out for years. I was not going to fight him on his terms or validate his illusions of power. I was going to obliterate the very source of his unearned confidence. I turned my attention back to my multi-monitor setup and opened a secure, encrypted communication channel with the lead corporate attorneys at my newly acquired Silicon Valley firm. I instructed them to draft a highly specific ironclad cease and desist order targeting Dominic business entity. The resulting document was an absolute masterpiece of corporate litigation. It explicitly revoked his startup licensing agreement to use the core algorithm, citing immediate intellectual property infringement and gross violation of the original commercial terms. The legal notice demanded an immediate total halt to all operations relying on the proprietary code and threatened catastrophic financial penalties for non-compliance that would personally bankrupt the executive board and hold them liable for millions in commercial damages. It was a corporate death warrant wrapped in dense, impenetrable legal phrasing. My legal team verified that the document was flawless, leaving zero loopholes for his startup to exploit, and zero room for his attorneys to maneuver. The trap was armed and fully operational. My lead attorneys sent a message through the secure channel asking if they should dispatch the process server to his luxury hotel immediately to deliver the killing blow. I hovered my finger over the keyboard, looking at the digital calendar synced to my right monitor. His highly anticipated Series A investor pitch, the prestigious event he had staked his entire fraudulent existence on, was scheduled for later that week. If I dropped the cease and desist order on him right now, he would simply cancel the event, play the victim card to his network, and try to spin a sympathetic story about larger corporate bullying to secure pity funds from naive angel investors. He would scurry away, avoid the public humiliation, and attempt to quietly rebuild his operation like a rat hiding in the shadows of the tech industry. I needed his destruction to be absolute, permanent, and highly public. I needed to ensure he could never secure another dollar of investment capital again. I instructed my legal team to hold the document back and wait for my direct authorization. I deliberately set a psychological and financial trap. I would allow Dominic to continue living in his expensive hotel suite under the illusion of impending wealth. I would let him continue draining the last drops of the stolen mortgage funds to rent out an extravagant ballroom for his pitch. I would let him build his elaborate stage, invite the wealthiest venture capitalists in the city, and inflate his massive ego to its absolute maximum capacity. I wanted him to step up to that podium, smiling confidently, fully believing he was an untouchable genius on the verge of making history. I was going to ensure that when his fragile empire finally crumbled, His spectacular fall would happen from the highest possible altitude, making any chance of professional recovery absolutely impossible. The morning after I armed the intellectual property trap, my corporate office line buzzed with an urgent notification from downstairs security. The pristine glass skyscraper where I orchestrated multi-million-dollar acquisitions was a fortress designed to keep unauthorized personnel firmly on the sidewalk. But Brittany had somehow managed to slip past the outer reception desk, fueled by pure arrogant entitlement. She was currently standing in the main lobby screaming at a pair of highly trained guards, demanding they summon the low-level administrative assistant who was maliciously harassing her brilliant brother. Brittany had always viewed me with profound disdain. In her mind, I was nothing more than a frumpy desk worker who fetched coffee and pushed papers for a boring logistics company. She genuinely believed she could march into my workplace, throw a massive public tantrum, and have my middle management supervisor fire me on the spot. She wanted to humiliate me in front of my coworkers and force me to drop my non-existent claims against Dominic. My lead security director asked if he should have local law enforcement remove the hostile trespasser from the premises. I looked at the live security feed on my monitor, watching her scream. I saw Brittany violently jab her finger into the chest of a guard who was twice her size. I smiled, leaning back in my leather chair. I told security to do the exact opposite. I instructed them to treat her with the utmost professional courtesy and escort her directly to the top-floor executive boardroom. I wanted her to see exactly whose territory she had foolishly invaded. While Brittany rode the private glass elevator up 45 floors, I walked down the hall to the boardroom. Terrence was already waiting there. I had called him exactly 1 full hour earlier. I requested his presence for a highly confidential financial review. As a brilliant forensic accountant, Terrence possessed a mind built on logic and hard data. He had spent years enduring the subtle racial microaggressions and blatant classist remarks from Patricia and Brittany, choosing to maintain the peace for the sake of his children. But after he uncovered Dominic forged mortgages at the hospital, our alliance had been permanently cemented. He knew I was preparing to dismantle his wife's family, and he wanted a front-row seat to the demolition. The heavy mahogany doors of the massive boardroom swung open forcefully. Brittany stormed inside, entirely prepared to unleash a torrent of rehearsed insults. She stopped dead in her tracks the moment she crossed the threshold. The sheer scale of wealth and corporate power surrounding her instantly suffocated her bravado. She found herself standing in a cavernous room featuring a 40-foot custom marble table, panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, and original artwork that cost more than her house. This was not the drab cubicle farm she had pictured. Her eyes darted around the intimidating space before finally landing on me. I was not wearing maternal sweatpants or a cheap blouse. I was dressed in a pristine, sharp-tailored power suit, standing confidently at the head of the table. The shock on her face was absolute perfection. She looked completely disoriented, unable to reconcile the ruthless corporate executive standing before her with the docile sister-in-law she had mocked for years. Then she noticed Terrence sitting quietly near the window, his dark eyes fixed on her. The confusion on Brittany's face morphed into defensive anger. She demanded to know what her husband was doing in my office and why I was pretending to be some high-powered executive corporate boss. She crossed her arms tightly, trying to regain her shattered sense of superiority, and launched into her prepared speech. She accused me of being a jealous, vindictive woman who was trying to ruin Dominic out of pure spite. She shrieked that her brother was on the verge of securing a massive venture capital investment, and that my pathetic attempts to freeze his assets would fail. She proudly declared that their family would always protect their own, and that I would end up with absolutely nothing. I let her talk. I let her voice echo against the soundproof glass walls perfectly. I allowed her to dig her own grave with every arrogant syllable. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word in my own defense. Instead, I calmly picked up a thick, heavily bound audit file from the table. I had my elite team of financial analysts compile the data overnight, tracing every single digital breadcrumb Brittany had left behind over the past 6 months. I walked around the marble table, completely ignoring Brittany. Furious demands for an answer, and slid the customized file directly in front of Terrence. Brittany stopped yelling. Her eyes followed the heavy folder. Her bravado suddenly evaporated into thin air. She asked what I was giving him, a slight tremor betraying the fear creeping into her voice. I maintained my absolute silence, stepping back to let the documents speak for themselves. Terrence opened the file. The room was so quiet I could hear the crisp sound of the heavy paper turning. He had always suspected his wife was hiding something, but he lacked the hard paper trail to prove it. As an accountant, he needed irrefutable proof. I had just handed him a loaded weapon. The documents contained verified banking records, wire logs. The file provided absolute irrefutable proof that Brittany had been secretly and systematically draining her and Terrence's joint life savings. But she did not stop there. The records clearly showed she had also liquidated the college funds they had painstakingly built for their two young children. She had completely hollowed out her own family financial foundation to secretly finance Dominic's failing tech startup and to fund the lavish, expensive dates he was treating Cameron to. She had stolen her own children's future to pay for her brother mistress. I watched Brittany's face drain of all color, losing every arrogant expression. The haughty, entitled golden child was suddenly hyperventilating, staring at the papers in her husband's hands with wide, terrified eyes. She took a step toward Terrence, stammering out a fragile, desperate lie, claiming the money was just a temporary bridge loan that Dominic promised to pay back with massive interest after his investor pitch. She swore she was just trying to help her brother secure his legacy, and that she was going to replace the funds before Terrence ever noticed they were missing. Terrence did not yell. He did not flip the table or curse at the weeping, pathetic woman. He did not scream at the wife who had just financially gutted their family. His reaction was far more devastating than any physical outburst. He methodically closed the audit file, squaring the edges of the folder with precise, deliberate movements. The absolute absence of anger on his face was terrifying. He looked at Brittany, not as a husband looking at a wife, but as an auditor looking at a fraudulent liability that needed to be immediately excised from the ledger. Without uttering a single word about the betrayal, he reached down into his leather briefcase and pulled out legal papers. He pulled out a crisp stack of freshly drafted legal documents and slid them across the polished marble table toward her. They were divorce papers accompanied by an emergency petition for sole financial and physical custody of their children, based on gross financial negligence. Brittany stared at the bold legal heading on the top page. Her entire world collapsed in an instant. She let out a guttural, sobbing gasp, reaching out to grab Terrence's arm, begging him to reconsider, promising she would fix the massive financial hole she had created. Terrence calmly stood up, brushing his suit jacket off swiftly. He stepped away from her desperate grasp. He informed her that his legal team would be in touch regarding the immediate sale of their home to recover the stolen assets. He then turned to me, gave a curt, respectful nod of gratitude, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving his soon-to-be ex-wife sobbing hysterically on the floor. I stood there looking down at the weeping woman who had invaded my hospital room just days ago to threaten my children. With a single file, I had completely amputated Dominic's main financial supply line, entirely removing her funding mechanism. I destroyed his most loyal enabler. Brittany had nothing left to give him, and she was about to face a brutal legal reckoning of her own. I pressed the intercom button on the wall and instructed my elite security team to escort the sobbing woman out of my building. She was dragged out, clutching the divorce papers representing the total destruction of her privileged life. The golden child had fallen, leaving Dominic entirely isolated. My strategy was working flawlessly. The board was set for the final financial execution, and I was more than ready to deliver the ultimate fatal blow. While Brittany was being escorted out of my building, clutching the divorce papers that officially severed her from her wealth, Dominic remained blissfully ignorant of his impending doom. He had decided to spend the afternoon playing the role of the triumphant tech mogul. He walked into an ultra-exclusive jewelry boutique on the Magnificent Mile with Cameron draped on his arm. He wanted to reward his mistress for playing the part of his devoted co-founder, and he intended to do it using the stolen equity from my premarital home. The boutique was a haven of quiet luxury, with armed guards at the doors and velvet-lined display cases holding diamonds that cost more than luxury vehicles. Dominic strutted to the VIP viewing room, demanding the manager bring out their most expensive engagement rings and tennis bracelets. He poured Cameron a glass of complimentary champagne, boasting loudly about his upcoming venture capital pitch and the millions he was about to secure. Cameron soaked up the attention, pointing a manicured finger at a stunning platinum diamond collar necklace. Dominic did not even ask for the price. He then just casually pulled out his heavy metal platinum credit card and dropped it onto the glass display case with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He believed he was completely untouchable, soaking in the admiration of the boutique staff, while his mistress smiled brightly beside him. The arrogant display was a perfect representation of his entire fraudulent existence, built on calculated lies and stolen money. He was nothing more than a spectacular temporary illusion, masking his true pathetic reality. The boutique manager picked up the card with white-gloved hands and walked over to the discreet checkout terminal. Dominic wrapped his arm around Cameron's waist, whispering about the lavish lifestyle they were about to build together. A few moments later, the manager returned. His professional smile was highly strained. He politely informed Dominic that the transaction had been violently declined. Dominic laughed it off, waving his hand dismissively and claiming it was just a standard fraud alert triggered by his massive wealth. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a second premium credit card, tossing it onto the counter. The manager processed the second card. The machine beeped a harsh red denial. The manager cleared his throat, leaning in close to quietly inform Dominic that the second card was also completely locked. The color began to drain from Dominic's face. He frantically pulled out his debit card linked directly to his primary checking account and shoved it at the manager, his voice rising in sheer panic. The machine rejected that one too. Every single piece of plastic in his wallet was completely dead. The boutique manager, maintaining his icy professional demeanor, discreetly asked Dominic and Cameron to leave the premises immediately. Cameron realized what was happening, and her face flushed dark red with absolute humiliation. She threw a minor tantrum right there in the VIP room, shouting at Dominic for embarrassing her in front of the wealthy clientele. She stormed out of the boutique, leaving Dominic standing at the counter completely paralyzed by the sudden financial blockade. He could not comprehend how his seemingly limitless supply of stolen funds had evaporated into thin air in mere seconds, leaving him utterly defenseless and entirely broke. His lavish facade was cracking apart right in front of the watchful public. He had absolutely no idea that I was the architect of his public embarrassment. Using the pristine forensic evidence of the forged secondary mortgages provided by Terrence, my high-powered legal team had executed a flawless emergency injunction earlier that morning. We bypassed standard family court procedures by filing the motion as an urgent measure to stop active financial fraud. We presented a federal judge with irrefutable proof that Dominic had criminally forged my signature to leverage my premarital assets. The judge took one look at the overwhelming paper trail and immediately granted our request. Within an hour, court orders were transmitted to every major banking institution in the country. All of Dominic's personal and business accounts tied to our marital assets were legally frozen pending a massive federal fraud investigation. He could not withdraw a single dollar. He could not transfer funds. He could not even buy a cup of coffee. I had successfully severed his financial oxygen supply, leaving him suffocating in the middle of a luxury jewelry store. His access to wealth was an illusion I had permitted him to maintain just long enough to make the sudden deprivation agonizing. My attorneys worked with surgical precision, ensuring the asset freeze trapped him completely without warning. Every hidden account, every secret credit line, every shadow fund he used to finance his pathetic double life was systematically located and neutralized by the federal injunction. The legal vice was tightened perfectly. He was completely stripped of his stolen resources and rendered financially impotent. He was entirely isolated from the capital he desperately needed to sustain his fraudulent business operations. I sat back in my dark office chair watching the confirmation notices roll in, perfectly satisfied that the trap had snapped shut exactly as I had meticulously designed it to happen. Dominic bolted from the boutique and sprinted back to his expensive luxury hotel suite, his mind racing with sheer panic. He grabbed his laptop and desperately tried to log into his commercial banking portal to access the emergency bridge loans he had secured for his startup. He needed that capital to pay for the massive ballroom rental and the catering for his upcoming investor pitch. When he typed in his password, a stark red error message flashed across his screen, stating that his commercial accounts had been locked due to an active federal audit. Terrence had not just served his wife divorce papers. The brilliant accountant had also made a series of anonymous, highly detailed tips to the federal banking regulators before leaving my office. He provided the exact routing numbers and transaction logs proving Dominic was commingling stolen personal funds with his corporate operating accounts. The regulators immediately triggered an automatic total freeze on Dominic's entire business portfolio. He was completely paralyzed. His tech empire was officially bankrupt before he even had the chance to step onto a stage. The walls were closing in on him at a terrifying speed. He had no money to pay the hotel bill. He had no money to pay his lawyers. He had absolutely nothing. He tore through his suite, opening all the drawers and throwing his belongings across the floor, searching for any hidden cash he might have stashed away. He found nothing but empty promises and dead plastic. The sudden realization that he was entirely destitute hit him with devastating force. He collapsed onto the very edge of the lavish hotel bed, gripping his hair in his hands, as his manufactured reality rapidly disintegrated around him. He was a ruined man drowning in the consequences of his own boundless arrogance. Driven to absolute madness by the realization that his stolen wealth had vanished, Dominic picked up his phone and dialed my number. I was sitting comfortably in the nursery holding a warm bottle of milk for my son. I watched my phone screen light up with his name. I did not answer. I just let it ring. The voicemails began arriving one after another. I hit play on the first message, keeping the volume low so it would not disturb them. Dominic's unhinged voice echoed through the quiet room. He was screaming loudly, demanding that I call the banks and unlock his money immediately. He then hurled vile insults, calling me a pathetic, vindictive woman who was trying to ruin his genius. The second voicemail was even more erratic. He promised to send his aggressive lawyers to destroy my life, threatening to have me thrown in jail. By the third voicemail, his rage escalated into blatant physical threats. He screamed that he would come to my house, break down the door, and make me pay for humiliating him. He promised to take my son away and leave me completely destitute. I sat in the rocking chair, burping my baby boy, my face completely devoid of fear. I was not intimidated by his pathetic screaming. I was collecting ammunition. With a calm, steady hand, I connected my phone to my secure corporate server. I meticulously downloaded and categorized every single unhinged, threatening audio file he sent. He was willingly handing me the exact evidence I needed to prove he was a violent, unstable threat to my children. He thought he was intimidating me. He did not realize he was actively digging his own grave for the upcoming custody battle, guaranteeing a judge would strip him of every parental right he possessed. The absolute financial blockade I had placed on Dominic did not just shatter his arrogant ego, it completely destabilized his mistress. Cameron had attached herself to a man she believed was a wildly successful tech founder. She envisioned a life of private flights, designer clothes, and exclusive corporate galas. Finding herself trapped in a hotel room with frozen credit cards and a raging destitute partner quickly shattered that illusion. She realized the stolen money was rapidly drying up, and she desperately needed to secure leverage over me to force a quick financial settlement. She could not comprehend that she was dealing with a corporate strategist who anticipated every possible angle of attack. Cameron decided to take matters into her own hands, utilizing the most vicious, manipulative tactics she could imagine. She maliciously picked up a phone and dialed Child Protective Services. Hiding behind the cowardice of an anonymous tip, Cameron filed a thoroughly fabricated and highly detailed report. She claimed I was suffering from severe, unmanaged postpartum psychosis. She told the authorities that I was actively neglecting my newborn twins, starving them, and living in an environment of absolute squalor. It was a calculated attempt to break my spirit and threaten the very thing I cherished most. She assumed that a surprise visit from state authorities would send me into a hysterical panic, forcing me to unlock the frozen marital assets just to make the nightmare go away. She wanted to create a documented history of maternal instability to aid Dominic in his delusional custody battle. She thought she was being incredibly clever. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the foyer of my home. I did not rush or panic. I simply pulled up my high-definition security camera feed on my tablet. Standing on my front porch was a stern-faced woman holding a thick clipboard displaying an official state badge clipped to her blazer. But my cameras captured much more than just the front steps. Panning the perimeter cameras down the block, I spotted a familiar black SUV parked discreetly under a large oak tree. I zoomed in on the tinted windshield. Dominic and Cameron were sitting inside the vehicle, their faces pressed against the glass, gleefully waiting to watch my children be dragged out of my home by state authorities. They were treating my potential devastation like an entertaining spectator sport. I calmly unlocked the front door and pulled it open, offering the social worker a warm, welcoming smile. She immediately stiffened, bracing herself for a hostile confrontation. She formally introduced herself, stating she was responding to a high-priority anonymous tip regarding the immediate welfare of 2 infants. She demanded entry to conduct a thorough surprise inspection of the premises, expecting to find the horrific conditions described in the report. I stepped aside gracefully and invited her inside without a single moment of hesitation. The moment she crossed the threshold, her stern, defensive demeanor began to visibly falter. She did not step into a chaotic, filthy environment. She stepped into a pristine, meticulously organized home that smelled of fresh linen and soft lavender. The hardwood floors were spotless. The temperature was perfectly regulated. There was absolutely no trace of the unhinged, neglected squalor Cameron had maliciously described over the phone. I led the social worker directly upstairs to the expansive nursery, where soft, natural light filtered through the large bay windows, illuminating the immaculate space. Sitting comfortably in a rocking chair was my highly qualified full-time professional night nurse. I introduced the nurse, who immediately stood and provided her extensive credentials, including her background as a specialized pediatric care provider. The babies were resting peacefully in their immaculate bassinets, looking healthy, vibrant, and impeccably cared for. I walked over to the changing station and handed the social worker our deeply detailed daily logs. I presented pages of pediatrician-approved dietary schedules, precise feeding measurements, weight tracking charts, and sleep cycle records. The documentation was thorough, clinical, and absolutely flawless, leaving zero room for doubt regarding the exceptional level of care my children were receiving. The social worker meticulously reviewed the charts, her professional skepticism rapidly dissolving into profound confusion. She checked the pristine condition of the nursery, inspected the ample supply of premium infant formula, and gently observed the sleeping twins. Finding absolutely nothing wrong with the babies, she turned her attention to me, clearly trying to reconcile the poised, articulate woman standing before her with the psychotic, neglected mother she had been dispatched to investigate. I anticipated this exact pivot. I walked over to my home office desk and retrieved a sealed beige envelope. I handed the envelope directly to the social worker. Inside were my comprehensive recent medical records. I provided pristine psychological and physical health evaluations conducted just 3 days prior by top-tier private doctors in the city. The medical reports explicitly confirmed my excellent mental health, completely dismantling the fabricated claims of postpartum psychosis. The documents proved I was healing perfectly from my surgery and operating with absolute cognitive clarity. The social worker read the physician's signatures and let out a long, heavy sigh, realizing she had been sent on a completely baseless wild goose chase. Once I was absolutely certain she was satisfied that my babies were thriving, I decided it was time to redirect her attention. I calmly walked downstairs to the kitchen island, inviting her to follow me. I poured her a fresh cup of coffee and slid a sleek black dossier across the polished granite countertop. I told her I knew exactly who had filed the malicious report, and I provided the undeniable proof. The social worker opened the black folder, and her eyes widened as she read the contents. I had instructed my elite corporate investigators to run a deep background check on Cameron the moment I saw her sitting on my sofa. The dossier exposed Cameron's true identity and completely unraveled her clean facade. The pages contained a highly documented criminal history from another state. Cameron had a distinct, verified pattern of filing false police reports to extort her previous romantic partners. She had weaponized municipal authorities before to extract financial settlements, using the legal system as a tool for personal harassment. I also provided the digital communication logs. My investigators had traced the anonymous call directly to a burner phone purchased at a convenience store located exactly 2 blocks from the luxury hotel where Dominic and Cameron were currently staying. The geographical data, coupled with her extensive history of extortion, created an airtight, irrefutable narrative. I watched the social worker face transform from professional embarrassment to absolute blistering fury. She realized that she had been used as a pawn in a malicious domestic dispute, diverting her vital time and resources away from children who actually needed state protection. The social worker snapped the black folder shut and forcefully tucked it under her arm. She thanked me for my profound cooperation and apologized for the intrusive disruption. I smiled, telling her she was simply doing her job to protect the vulnerable. I walked her to the front door and watched her step out onto the porch. She did not walk toward her official state vehicle parked in my driveway. Instead, she turned sharply and marched directly down the sidewalk, her low heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. I pulled up my security camera feed and watched the scene unfold with absolute satisfaction. The social worker marched straight toward the black SUV parked under the oak tree. Inside the vehicle, Dominic and Cameron suddenly realized she was heading their way. I could see the panic erupting in the front seats. The social worker reached the passenger side window and rapped her knuckles forcefully against the tinted glass, demanding it be rolled down immediately. Cameron slowly lowered the window, her face entirely drained of color. The social worker did not hold back. She leaned down and informed Cameron that her identity had been fully verified and her malicious, anonymous tip had been completely debunked. She stated with absolute authority that wasting municipal resources and weaponizing Child Protective Services was a severe criminal offense. She looked Cameron dead in the eye and informed her that she was being formally referred to local law enforcement for filing a malicious and false child abuse report. She promised that detectives would be visiting her hotel room shortly to discuss her actions. She had attempted to orchestrate my destruction and instead found herself facing imminent arrest. The realization that Dominic could not protect her and that his stolen money was gone shattered her completely. Cameron shoved the car door open and scrambled out onto the sidewalk. She did not look back at the man she had conspired with. She fled, running down the street desperately, trying to escape the immediate legal consequences of her horrific miscalculation. Dominic sat alone in the driver's seat, watching his mistress abandon him, gripping the steering wheel in total paralyzed defeat. The sight of Dominic sitting completely paralyzed in his vehicle marked a profound shift in the dynamics of his crumbling empire. With his mistress fleeing down the street and his financial resources entirely frozen, he was out of options. The desperate reality of his situation rapidly trickled down to the rest of his entitled family. Patricia, realizing that her golden boy was spiraling toward total ruin, decided to take matters into her own hands. She believed she was the ultimate matriarch, a woman of immense social standing and untouchable power. She assumed Dominic had simply mishandled the situation by allowing his emotions to dictate his strategy. In her arrogant mind, I was still just a fragile, exhausted desk worker who could easily be bullied into submission by someone with superior wealth and social influence. She reached out to me demanding a private meeting at her highly exclusive suburban country club. She framed the invitation as a benevolent attempt to negotiate a peaceful truce for the sake of the family legacy, expecting me to be eternally grateful for her manufactured mercy and sudden generosity. I accepted the invitation immediately, knowing exactly what kind of trap she intended to set. I arrived at the sprawling manicured country club the following afternoon, dressed in a simple conservative outfit that perfectly maintained the illusion of an intimidated daughter-in-law. I deliberately wore flat shoes and minimal makeup to emphasize my supposed exhaustion. I wanted her to feel incredibly powerful and completely in control of the narrative. I found Patricia sitting on the sunlit outdoor patio overlooking the pristine 18th hole. She was sipping a sparkling mineral water, wearing designer sunglasses, and exuding an aura of absolute superiority. She did not stand to greet me or offer a polite welcome. She simply gestured toward the empty wrought iron chair opposite her, signaling for me to sit. Patricia did not waste time with pleasantries. She immediately launched into a highly orchestrated monologue designed to strip away my confidence. She slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table. It was a drafted settlement offer that was insultingly low. She proposed a modest cash payout that barely covered a few months of basic living expenses. In exchange for this pathetic sum, she laid out her ruthless demands. She required me to sign over the deed to my premarital home immediately. She demanded I surrender full physical custody of my infant son to Dominic so he could be raised with the proper advantages of their family name. She expected me to take my daughter and walk away entirely quietly and without any further legal resistance. To ensure my compliance, she laced her proposal with thinly veiled threats. She casually mentioned her extensive network of influential friends on various corporate boards, heavily implying she could use her vast social connections to permanently ruin my modest career if I dared to fight her in court. She looked at me with a cold, calculating stare, entirely convinced she had offered me a generous escape route from a battle I could never possibly win. I kept my posture rigid and my gaze lowered, playing the role of the terrified, helpless woman she desperately wanted me to be. I allowed my voice to tremble slightly as I asked her how she expected me to survive without my home, and how Dominic could possibly afford to raise a child when his accounts were currently frozen. I begged her to understand the precarious position she was forcing me into, pushing her pride to the absolute limit. My feigned weakness acted like high-octane gasoline on the raging fire of her massive ego. Patricia leaned forward eagerly, resting her elbows on the table, completely unable to resist the rare opportunity to gloat about her perceived strategic brilliance. I asked her specifically about the secondary mortgages, questioning how Dominic managed to secure such massive loans without my knowledge. Patricia let out a dismissive scoff, clearly amused by my apparent ignorance. Blinded by her own supreme arrogance, she openly admitted that she knew all about the forged signatures. She proudly revealed that she had personally advised Dominic on which private lenders to approach to bypass the standard marital consent verifications. She bragged about connecting him with aggressive financiers who did not ask difficult questions. She confessed to being a fully willing and active participant in the systematic theft of my home equity. I pressed further, maintaining my fragile facade. I asked her about Cameron, expressing confusion over why Dominic would risk his family for a mistress. Patricia rolled her eyes at my sentimental question. She callously explained that Cameron was never about love or romance. She admitted that she had personally encouraged Dominic to use the young, naive woman as a prop to secure more startup funding. She detailed how Cameron's connections to certain angel investors made her a valuable temporary asset for the company. Patricia openly confessed to actively facilitating the affair and orchestrating the extortion of my property, all to ensure her son achieved the billionaire status she felt their family inherently deserved. She spoke with absolute impunity, believing her wealth shielded her from any legal or moral consequences. She had absolutely no idea that I was wearing a highly advanced discreet dictaphone securely fastened beneath my collar. The state-of-the-art device was capturing every single arrogant syllable in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. I was not sitting there absorbing her abuse out of fear. I was meticulously conducting a tactical interrogation. I needed her to explicitly detail her direct involvement in the financial crimes to build an airtight criminal case against her. My legal team required irrefutable proof of her complicity to ensure she went down alongside her son. With every smug confession and every cruel justification, Patricia was systematically weaving her own inescapable legal noose. She provided precise names, dates, and motivations, establishing a clear, undeniable pattern of premeditated fraud and malicious extortion. She handed me the exact weapon required to dismantle her entirely. Once I was absolutely certain I had captured every necessary admission to ensure her total legal destruction, I stopped trembling. I slowly sat back in my wrought iron chair and let the frightened daughter-in-law facade completely dissolve. I squared my shoulders and looked her dead in the eye, my expression shifting from manufactured fear to absolute freezing calculation. Patricia stopped talking mid-sentence. The sudden drastic change in my demeanor completely unsettled her. The air between us instantly grew heavy and tense as she realized the woman sitting across from her was not the pathetic victim she had envisioned. I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen to stop the hidden recording application synced to my device. I looked at Patricia and delivered my response in a flat, emotionless tone. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I coldly thanked her for her comprehensive confession, detailing her direct involvement as an accessory to severe mortgage fraud and corporate extortion. I informed her that my legal team would find her recorded testimony incredibly useful for the upcoming federal investigations. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face, leaving her perfectly manicured features looking pale and suddenly aged. Her jaw dropped as the horrific realization of what she had just done washed over her. She had willingly confessed to multiple felonies on a recorded line, actively implicating herself in a massive financial conspiracy. She tried to stammer out a denial, claiming the recording was illegal, but I simply stood up from the table, adjusting my coat with precise, elegant movements. I informed her that we were currently residing in a one-party consent state, rendering her entire arrogant confession completely admissible in both civil and criminal court proceedings. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or hurl another hollow threat. The conversation was definitively over. I turned my back on the terrified matriarch and walked away from the patio, leaving her sitting alone in stunned, horrified silence. Her entire world was collapsing around her. As I strode confidently through the lavish lobby of the country club, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick encrypted message to Terrence. Patricia had proudly ordered an extravagant spread of imported champagne and imported caviar during our meeting, fully intending to make me pay the exorbitant bill as a final petty humiliation. What she did not know was that Terrence, acting with his usual swift forensic precision, had just permanently canceled every single credit card connected to her primary banking portfolio. The financial lockdown was now completely absolute. I stepped out into the crisp, freezing afternoon air, completely satisfied knowing that the wealthy, arrogant woman who had just confessed to destroying my family was about to face the ultimate indignity of a violently declined credit card in the middle of her precious, elite country club, while the highly aggressive waiters actively surrounded her table. I stepped out of the elite country club and into the crisp afternoon air, carrying the highly incriminating digital recording of Patricia sealing her own legal fate. The brutal financial lockdown Terrence had brilliantly initiated was already working its silent, devastating magic inside the lavish dining room. I climbed into my waiting vehicle and headed straight back to my secure home office to prepare for the very next critical phase of the demolition. The clock was ticking down with absolute, unforgiving precision. It was exactly 24 hours before Dominic was scheduled to step onto the brightly lit stage of the Four Seasons Hotel ballroom for his massive Series A investor presentation. The mounting pressure on him was reaching a truly critical breaking point. His personal bank accounts remained completely frozen by my aggressive legal team, and he was undoubtedly receiving frantic, panicked phone calls from his mother regarding her publicly declined credit cards at the country club. The walls of his fabricated reality were closing in rapidly, but rather than experiencing a rare moment of humility, Dominic leaned heavily into his toxic, blinding arrogance. Driven by sheer financial desperation and a deeply rooted, unshakable belief in his own superiority, he desperately sought to regain some fleeting semblance of control. He quickly drafted a highly aggressive, incredibly arrogant email and sent it directly to my personal private email account. He desperately needed to project absolute dominance, even as his entire fraudulent criminal empire crumbled around him, trying hopelessly to convince both himself and me that he remained an untouchable, invincible force in the highly competitive corporate business world. I watched the notification pop up on my high-definition monitor and opened the message with total clinical detachment. The email was a frantic, disorganized manifestation of his massive ego, attempting to mask his underlying terror. He proudly boasted that he was less than a day away from officially securing $20 million in clean venture capital funding. He outlined his grand, vindictive plan to use that massive influx of wealth to hire a team of the most ruthless, expensive family law attorneys in the city. He vividly described how he intended to crush me in family court, systematically strip away my custody rights, and leave me completely destitute on the street. He painted himself as an untouchable tech visionary who had finally outsmarted his boring, uninspired wife. He genuinely believed that this upcoming investor pitch would serve as his ultimate salvation, magically erasing all his financial crimes and elevating him to the billionaire status he felt he inherently deserved. He assumed his threatening words would send me into a spiral of fear and submission. I read every single delusional word of his lengthy email, and I did not type a single keystroke in response. I simply archived the message, saving it to the highly secure server containing the mountain of evidence for our upcoming custody battle. Instead of engaging in a pathetic emotional argument over email, I picked up my phone and authorized my corporate legal team to initiate the intellectual property strike. Across the city in a high-end short-term rented office space, Dominic was frantically pacing back and forth, putting the final touches on his fraudulent slide deck. He was entirely focused on perfecting his charismatic presentation, completely unaware of the legal missile heading directly toward his desk. A professional process server bypassed the temporary receptionist and walked straight through the glass doors of Dominic's rented conference room. The server was an imposing figure, holding a thick, rigid legal envelope that required a direct physical signature for receipt. Dominic, assuming the package contained standard desperate divorce filings or temporary custody demands from my seemingly overwhelmed lawyers, snatched the clipboard and signed his name with a highly annoyed flourish. He dismissed the server with a quick wave of his hand, eager to return to his presentation rehearsals. He tossed the heavy envelope onto his polished desk, fully intending to ignore whatever pathetic legal plea he thought I had sent. He wanted to focus solely on the millions of dollars he believed were waiting for him the very next day. But overwhelming curiosity and pure, unadulterated arrogance eventually got the better of his judgment. Dominic tore open the thick cardboard envelope, fully expecting to find a pathetic settlement request or a desperate plea for financial mediation. Instead, he pulled out a formal, aggressively drafted cease and desist order. The legal language printed on the crisp white paper was incredibly dense and utterly uncompromising. The document explicitly targeted his startup company and immediately revoked all licensing rights to the core algorithm his entire business model relied upon. It clearly outlined an immediate intellectual property infringement and threatened catastrophic commercial damages if he continued to use, distribute, or pitch the proprietary software in any capacity whatsoever. The signature at the bottom of the commanding document belonged to the chief legal counsel of the holding company that had recently acquired the bankrupt Silicon Valley tech firm. The color completely drained from Dominic's face as his eyes rapidly scanned the severe legal warnings. He realized in a matter of terrifying seconds that his highly touted proprietary technology was officially dead. Without legal access to that specific algorithm, his entire startup was nothing more than a hollow shell, an empty concept with absolutely zero functional value or market potential. A profound, devastating wave of panic set in as he stared at the corporate death warrant resting on his desk. He was exactly 24 hours away from asking the most powerful investors in the city for $20 million based on a technology platform he no longer legally possessed. But his extreme narcissism quickly overpowered his fleeting sense of reality. He simply could not fathom the idea of canceling his prestigious pitch, facing public humiliation and admitting total defeat to his wealthy peers. Driven by the dangerous, deeply ingrained belief that he could simply fake it until he made it, he made a disastrous, calculated decision. He convinced himself that he could march into that grand hotel ballroom, lie directly to the faces of the venture capitalists, secure their massive funding first, and then use their own money to secretly fight the intellectual property lawsuit later. He violently shoved the formal cease and desist order into the bottom drawer of his rented desk, deliberately choosing to bury the devastating legal reality. He resolved to proceed with the massive investor presentation exactly as planned, wearing his custom-tailored suit and flashing his charismatic smile, perfectly willing to gamble his entire freedom on a massive, elaborate lie. What Dominic completely failed to realize in his arrogant, desperate frenzy was the true identity of the holding company that had just issued the restrictive order. He did not bother to thoroughly research the corporate entity listed at the very top of the severe legal notice. If he had taken even 5 minutes to investigate, he would have discovered a truth that would have chilled him to the bone. The aggressive holding company that now legally owned his core technology was a specialized subsidiary entirely owned and operated by my own mergers and acquisitions firm. By intentionally hiding the official legal notice and making the conscious, deliberate decision to proceed with his fraudulent funding pitch, Dominic had just crossed a massive, uncrossable line. He willingly moved from committing a simple civil contract violation straight into the incredibly dangerous realm of severe federal financial crime. I was sitting comfortably at my multi-monitor workstation, tracking the delivery confirmation receipt from the process server in real time. I watched the digital timestamp appear on my screen, confirming that he had officially received and signed for the restrictive documents. I now possessed the exact legal proof I needed to destroy him. I had irrefutable documented evidence demonstrating his explicit, premeditated intent to commit massive investor fraud on a highly public stage. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he no longer owned the technology, yet he was actively choosing to solicit millions of dollars based on that exact stolen asset. The trap I had so meticulously constructed was no longer just set, it was completely locked and bolted tightly shut. Dominic had willingly tightened the legal noose around his own neck, driven entirely by his insatiable greed and his endless arrogance. He honestly thought he was walking into a spectacular celebration of his entrepreneurial genius, completely blind to the fact that he was actually walking straight into a meticulously planned corporate execution. I shut down my secure servers, organizing the final digital files, and walked quietly upstairs to check on my sleeping twins, feeling a profound sense of absolute calm settling over me. Tomorrow night, I would finally step out of the shadows and reveal my true identity to the man who had coldly discarded me in a sterile hospital room. I was perfectly prepared to kick the chair out from under his fragile empire and watch his entire fabricated world shatter apart. The following evening descended upon the city, carrying the electric anticipation of a high-stakes corporate showdown. Inside the lavish suite of the luxury hotel, Dominic was operating on a dangerous mixture of sheer panic and expensive scotch. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating scent of his designer cologne and the unspoken tension radiating from his mistress. He paced the length of the suite, gripping a crystal tumbler, forcing Cameron to squeeze into a highly restrictive, uncomfortable designer gown. He needed her to play the role of the devoted, adoring co-founder, a visual prop to sell his illusion of stability to the wealthy venture capitalists. Cameron looked miserable, constantly adjusting the tight fabric and complaining about the sudden freezing of their accounts, but Dominic offered zero sympathy. His focus was entirely consumed by his own fabricated reality. On the marble nightstand, his smartphone vibrated relentlessly. The screen flashed continuously with urgent incoming calls from his junior legal counsel. His lawyers had undoubtedly discovered the aggressive cease and desist order he had foolishly attempted to bury in his desk drawer the previous afternoon. They were desperately trying to reach him to halt the impending disaster before he committed a massive public felony. Dominic angrily swiped the notifications away, silencing the device and downing the rest of his drink in one gulp. He was aggressively choosing to ignore the massive legal avalanche heading straight for him, relying entirely on his blinding narcissism. He genuinely believed that if he could just stand under the bright stage lights and deliver a charismatic pitch, he could secure the $20 million and retroactively fix his massive legal liabilities. He completely convinced himself that his charm could override hard legal documentation. He grabbed his tailored tuxedo jacket, ignoring the sweat beading on his forehead, and prepared to walk into a room full of sharks, completely oblivious to the fact that he was the prey. Across town, in stark contrast to his chaotic desperation, a scene of absolute calculated precision was unfolding. I stood at the head of a sprawling mahogany table inside a high-tech corporate war room located on the top floor of my investment firm. The exhaustion and physical pain of my emergency delivery had been entirely compartmentalized, replaced by cold, unyielding focus. I was not the fragile, bleeding woman he had abandoned in the dead of winter. I was dressed in a striking, immaculate, bespoke power suit, crafted from deep charcoal wool, fitting my healing frame like modern armor. My hair was styled with severe perfection, and my posture projected absolute command. Terrence sat to my right, methodically organizing the final forensic dossiers. His sharp, analytical mind had compiled every single forged signature, every illicit wire transfer, and every fraudulent mortgage application into devastatingly clear visual graphics. Our senior investment partners, men and women who routinely dismantled global corporations, flanked the rest of the table. We were aligning our precise strategy for the night. There was no room for error or emotional outbursts. Our approach was rooted entirely in undisputed legality and absolute devastation. We reviewed the exact timing for the digital override, ensuring that the moment Dominic attempted to sell his stolen technology, my firm would publicly execute our intellectual property rights. Terrence handed me a secure master control tablet confirming the audiovisual hijack was primed and fully operational. He had interfaced with the hotel network earlier in the day, bypassing their security protocols with his usual forensic brilliance. I looked around the room at the team of financial titans who had backed my hostile takeover and gave a single affirming nod. The corporate execution was officially authorized to proceed. We gathered our heavy leather portfolios and moved toward the private elevators, operating with the silent, synchronized efficiency of a highly trained strike team preparing to decimate an enemy stronghold. The setting for his impending destruction was the grand ballroom of the prestigious Four Seasons Hotel. The opulent space was adorned with cascading crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and a massive open bar serving top-tier champagne to the city elite. The room was rapidly filling with the most influential tech journalists, angel investors, and venture capitalists in the state. The air buzzed with the lucrative potential of discovering the next massive technology unicorn. Walking through the heavy gilded doors with an air of unearned royalty were Patricia and Brittany. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had arrived dressed in overly flashy, ostentatious gowns that screamed for attention. They immediately gravitated toward the center of the room, acting as if they personally owned the entire hotel. Patricia proudly held a flute of expensive champagne, aggressively inserting herself into conversations with wealthy financiers to brag about her son. She loudly boasted to anyone who would listen about his impending billionaire status, framing him as a solitary genius who was about to revolutionize the tech industry. Brittany stood right beside her, eagerly nodding along and throwing her head back in exaggerated laughter. They were completely intoxicated by the illusion of proximity to massive wealth, entirely convinced that they had successfully eliminated me from the family legacy. They reveled in their shared cruelty, fully believing that I was currently sitting in a dark house drowning in financial ruin, while they prepared to ascend to the absolute highest ranks of high society. They casually mocked my supposed breakdown, to complete strangers spinning a horrific narrative about a jealous, unstable wife who simply could not handle her brilliant husband rising to the top. They eagerly scanned the room, waiting for their golden boy to take the stage and validate their lifelong belief in his absolute superiority. They were practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, completely unaware that every single investor they were currently attempting to impress was about to witness the most spectacular corporate slaughter of the decade. Just outside the main entrance of the hotel, a fleet of polished, blacked-out SUVs pulled up smoothly to the velvet-roped VIP curb. The hotel valets rushed forward immediately, recognizing the arrival of major institutional money. The heavy door of the lead vehicle swung open, revealing the vibrant city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk flanked by a highly intimidating security detail and the elite senior partners of my investment firm. The cold evening wind caught the edge of my tailored coat as I walked confidently through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the bustling hotel lobby. The marble floors clicked under my heels as my team moved in a tight protective formation, heading directly toward the grand ballroom. As we approached the heavy mahogany doors leading into the main event space, the sheer volume of the crowded room washed over us. I spotted Patricia and Brittany standing mere feet away from the VIP investor entrance. They were busy sipping their drinks and scanning the crowd for important faces, desperate to make eye contact with anyone holding a venture capital checkbook. I did not alter my pace or look away. I walked straight past them, closing the physical distance, until I was close enough to smell Patricia's signature heavy perfume. I kept my chin high, my expression entirely unreadable, as I glided directly through their line of sight. Patricia and Brittany's eyes swept directly over my face as they surveyed the incoming crowd. They looked right at the commanding, powerful woman leading a team of Wall Street heavyweights into the exclusive investor section, and they looked right past me. Because they had spent years convincing themselves I was nothing more than a frumpy, exhausted administrative assistant completely beneath their notice, they entirely failed to recognize the corporate apex predator standing right in front of them. Their profound, blinding arrogance rendered me completely invisible to their greedy eyes. They saw the expensive bespoke suit. They saw the imposing security detail. And they saw the deference the hotel staff paid to my arrival. But their prejudiced minds simply could not process that the titan walking past them was the very same woman they had verbally abused in a hospital recovery room. They continued sipping their champagne, eagerly waiting for the show to begin, entirely ignorant of the fact that I was the one holding the curtain. I stepped past the heavy velvet rope and took my seat in the darkened VIP section, settling into the plush leather chair reserved for the lead institutional investor. Terrence sat silently beside me, opening his laptop and connecting to the hotel primary audiovisual feed. I crossed my legs, resting my hands perfectly still on the polished wooden table in front of me. A cold, triumphant smile finally spread across my face as the ambient lights in the massive ballroom began to slowly dim. The trap was now perfectly flawlessly set, and Dominic was about to walk right into the center of the crosshairs. The heavy velvet curtains at the front of the grand ballroom parted, and the ambient lighting faded into complete darkness. A single bright spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the stage. Dominic stepped into the brilliant white circle of light, exuding an aura of supreme manufactured confidence. He wore his custom-tailored tuxedo with practiced ease, projecting the exact image of a visionary tech founder on the brink of massive global success. The audience of elite venture capitalists and influential angel investors quieted down their attention, fully captured by his polished entrance. He gripped the microphone and launched into his highly rehearsed pitch. His delivery was incredibly smooth, entirely devoid of the frantic desperation that had consumed him just hours earlier in his hotel suite. He paced the stage with calculated, measured steps, spinning an intricate, dazzling, and entirely fabricated narrative about his startup. He spoke passionately about revolutionizing the technology sector, leaning heavily on buzzwords and grandiose promises. He detailed his projected multi-million-dollar revenue streams, painting a picture of exponential, limitless growth. Down in the very first row, Patricia and Brittany sat practically vibrating with absolute glee. They wore matching expressions of profound, smug satisfaction, clapping enthusiastically at every pause in his speech. They looked around at the wealthy financiers seated near them, beaming with unearned pride, entirely convinced that they were witnessing the birth of their family new billionaire empire. The sheer audacity of their display was genuinely staggering. They sipped their complimentary champagne and exchanged incredibly smug glances, fully assuming that the rest of their privileged lives would be funded by the very technological innovation that was currently being detailed on the stage. They hung onto Dominic, every word completely blinded by the glittering illusion he was projecting from the stage. From my vantage point in the darkened VIP section, I watched the entire performance with icy clinical detachment. Terrence sat silently beside me, his eyes fixed on the massive high-definition projection screen looming directly behind Dominic. We were watching a man eagerly build his own scaffold, entirely unaware of the trapdoor resting right beneath his expensive leather shoes. Dominic masterfully steered his presentation toward its ultimate climax. He masterfully built the anticipation in the room, elevating his voice as he promised to reveal the absolute core of his competitive advantage. He boasted that the next slide would showcase the undisputed superiority of his proprietary algorithm and the flawless financial health of his rapidly expanding enterprise. He gestured expansively toward the back of the ballroom, signaling the hotel audiovisual team to transition to his crucial data projection slide. The wealthy investors leaned forward in their plush seats, pulling out their expensive pens and leather-bound notebooks, eager to verify the hard numbers backing up his charismatic claims. The incredibly massive financial stakes could not possibly have been any higher for a struggling entrepreneur. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom was incredibly tense, filled with the lucrative promise of a highly profitable venture capital acquisition. Dominic turned slightly toward the massive screen behind him, a wide, triumphant smile plastered across his face, ready to bask in the overwhelming awe of his elite audience. Down in the VIP shadows, I slowly lifted the master control tablet Terrence had securely linked to the hotel main broadcasting network. My thumb hovered directly over the primary execution command. I waited for the exact perfect millisecond to initiate the absolute destruction of his fraudulent reality. The massive high-definition screen spanning the entire width of the stage suddenly flickered violently. A loud, disruptive burst of static feedback echoed sharply through the ballroom's sophisticated surround sound system, causing several investors in the front rows to visibly wince. Dominic's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, attempting to smoothly play off the technical glitch as a minor hotel malfunction. He confidently raised his microphone to make a charming, self-deprecating joke, but the words completely died in his throat. The screen behind him did not display his carefully curated, colorful revenue charts or his fabricated user acquisition metrics. Instead, a series of highly sensitive, devastatingly clear legal documents was projected in massive 50-foot high-definition resolution for every single financial titan in the room to scrutinize. On the left side of the towering display, the official intellectual property ownership certificate materialized. The dense legal text was highlighted in bright, unmistakable yellow marker, explicitly proving that Dominic business entity owned absolutely zero rights to the core algorithm he had just spent 20 minutes passionately selling to the audience. The certificate proudly bore the official corporate watermark of my investment firm's subsidiary, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his entire technological foundation was a complete illusion. The undeniable visual proof hung suspended over his head, acting as a massive digital tombstone for his fraudulent company. The stark reality of the legal paperwork completely obliterated the charming fictitious narrative he had just spent tremendous energy carefully weaving for his elite audience. On the right side of the massive screen, a secondary set of documents instantly loaded. These were the heavily redacted but glaringly obvious banking records Terrence had meticulously compiled. The forensic accounting displayed a crystal-clear, undeniable trail of severe financial crimes. The massive projection showcased the exact routing numbers and transaction logs, detailing the fraudulently diverted funds stemming directly from the forged secondary mortgages he had illegally taken out on my premarital home. The screen provided an inescapable visual map demonstrating how the stolen capital had been desperately funneled into his failing startup operating accounts to create a pathetic facade of corporate liquidity. The evidence laid bare his deliberate, systematic intent to commit massive investor fraud on a highly public stage. The murmurs in the grand ballroom started as a low, confused hum and rapidly escalated into a deafening roar of absolute outrage. The elite venture capitalists and seasoned angel investors were not foolish people. They instantly recognized the severe legal and financial implications of the documents blaring from the stage. They were looking at hard, irrefutable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy unfolding right before their eyes. Absolute chaos erupted across the elegant ballroom floor. The wealthy financiers immediately pulled out their smartphones, furiously typing messages to their legal teams and aggressively snapping photos of the highly incriminating evidence displayed on the massive screen. Investors who had been leaning forward in anticipation just moments ago were now standing up violently, pushing their chairs back in sheer disgust. Patricia and Brittany leaped up from their front row seats, their faces drained of all color, their earlier arrogant celebrations completely replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. They stared up at the towering financial records, completely unable to comprehend how their golden boy triumphant coronation had suddenly transformed into a spectacular criminal exposure. Dominic completely lost his mind. He spun around to face the devastating projections, the blood rushing to his face as extreme blinding panic set in. He frantically waved his arms at the back of the room, screaming wildly into his live microphone. His voice cracked with sheer desperation as he loudly blamed a malicious external hack, begging and pleading with the hotel audiovisual team to cut the main power to the massive screen. He desperately ordered them to shut down the projectors, claiming his presentation had been sabotaged by jealous corporate rivals. The AV technicians scrambled frantically at their control boards, but Terrence had executed a flawless digital lockdown, completely freezing them out of their own broadcasting system. The catastrophic evidence remained glowing brightly above the stage, an inescapable monument to his profound arrogance and greed. The stark, brightly illuminated numbers detailing his illicit spending habits cast a harsh, unforgiving glare across his sweating, panicked features, perfectly highlighting the utter collapse of his fraudulent empire. The room was practically vibrating with the intense, chaotic energy of betrayed institutional wealth, rapidly mobilizing to protect its interests. The deafening roar of the outraged investors completely drowned out his pathetic, frantic screaming. Suddenly, the primary stage lights violently cut to black, plunging Dominic into total darkness. A single piercingly bright spotlight cut sharply through the heavy shadows of the grand ballroom, sweeping rapidly across the high ceiling before dropping straight down into the exclusive VIP section. The brilliant white beam landed perfectly illuminating my position. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, the immaculate lines of my bespoke power suit contrasting sharply against the surrounding darkness. I held the glowing master control tablet loosely in my hand, projecting absolute, unyielding authority. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence as hundreds of eyes followed the spotlight tracking the architect of this brutal corporate execution. The brilliant illumination trapped me in a halo of stark, unforgiving clarity, ensuring that every single person present understood exactly who was currently controlling the narrative. My steady, unwavering gaze locked directly onto the utterly destroyed man, standing frozen on the darkened stage, confirming his absolute immediate professional termination. Dominic stared into the blinding beam of the spotlight, his face contorted in a grotesque mixture of sheer terror and blinding confusion. For several heavy seconds, his brain simply could not process the sight before him. The woman illuminated in the VIP section was not the exhausted, meek administrative assistant he had abandoned in a hospital room just weeks ago. She was a titan of industry, clad in bespoke charcoal armor radiating absolute authority. When the initial shock finally shattered, his fragile ego violently took over. He gripped the edges of his wooden podium, his knuckles turning completely white, and unleashed a guttural scream of absolute rage. He leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing frantically across the massive ballroom. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my illuminated figure and demanded that the hotel security immediately remove the crazy, obsessed woman, ruining his presentation. He shouted to the wealthy investors that I was simply a bitter, estranged wife, trying to sabotage his genius out of pure spite. He desperately ordered the security guards stationed around the perimeter to physically drag me out of the building. A dozen highly trained security personnel immediately stepped forward, moving with swift, tactical precision. Dominic let out a breathless laugh of relief, fully expecting to watch me be humiliated, and forcibly escorted out the heavy mahogany doors. Instead, the guards completely bypassed the center aisle. They marched directly toward the VIP section, their eyes focused and professional. They did not reach for my arms or attempt to touch me. They seamlessly formed a solid, impenetrable wall of protection, completely surrounding my chair and shielding me from any potential hostility. The head of hotel security turned his back to the stage and gave me a curt, respectful nod, acknowledging my absolute command of the room. Dominic's triumphant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, sickening dread. He finally realized that the security detail was not there to remove an unstable intruder. They were there to protect a highly valued corporate asset. The profound shift in power was entirely undeniable. Sitting in the front row of the VIP section was Maxwell, the notoriously ruthless head of the most prominent venture capital firm in the city. He was the primary target of Dominic's entire fraudulent pitch. Maxwell slowly stood up from his plush leather seat, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, measured movements. He did not look at Dominic. He turned his back entirely on the stage, projecting absolute dismissal and disgust toward the sweating, desperate man standing at the podium. Maxwell turned to face me, offering a deep, respectful bow of his head. He gestured toward the center aisle, explicitly yielding the floor to my authority. He recognized the corporate hierarchy and publicly validated my absolute dominance over the situation. The murmurs in the grand ballroom instantly died down. The sprawling, elegant space went dead silent. Hundreds of the most influential financial minds in the city held their collective breath, waiting for the apex predator to finally speak. I handed the master control tablet to Terrence, who sat silently beside me, managing the digital projections. A member of my security detail handed me a sleek wireless microphone. I stood up tall, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor as I stepped out from behind the protective wall of guards. I did not rush. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle, the spotlight tracking my every movement. I stopped exactly 10 feet from the edge of the stage, looking up at the pathetic, trembling shell of a man who had tried to destroy me. I raised the microphone, and my voice carried through the massive ballroom, smooth, cold, and utterly merciless. I introduced myself not as his discarded wife, but by my true professional title. I announced my position as Senior Director of Mergers and Acquisitions at one of the most aggressive investment funds in the country. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. I saw Patricia and Brittany physically recoil in their front row seats, their faces draining of blood, as the horrific realization of my true identity finally crashed down upon them. With surgical precision, I began to verbally dissect his entire fabricated business model. I pointed to the massive high-definition screen behind him, referencing the intellectual property certificate. I calmly explained to the room of investors that my firm had successfully executed a hostile takeover of the bankrupt Silicon Valley tech firm less than 48 hours ago. I explicitly stated that my subsidiary company was now the sole legal owner of the exact proprietary algorithm Dominic was currently attempting to sell them. I did not stop there. I methodically moved down the list of his financial crimes, exposing the raw, unredacted truth to the people holding the checkbooks. I detailed the forged secondary mortgages he had illegally taken out using my premarital home as collateral. I explained how he had diverted those stolen funds to temporarily, artificially inflate his corporate operating accounts, creating a completely fraudulent illusion of liquidity. I revealed the existence of the hidden offshore accounts he used to finance a lavish lifestyle and fund his mistress, while simultaneously bankrupting his own business. I laid out the precise dates and amounts, rendering him entirely toxic to every single investor in the room. I explained that engaging in any business with this man would trigger an immediate federal audit and entangle their funds in a massive criminal conspiracy. I completely dismantled his reputation, transforming him from a promising tech visionary into a severe, catastrophic liability in a matter of minutes. Dominic was physically shaking. Sweat poured down his face, ruining his pristine image. He gripped the podium as if it were a life raft, frantically trying to formulate a defense, but his mouth simply opened and closed without producing a single sound. I took one step closer to the stage, narrowing my gaze solely on him. I deliberately shifted my tone, moving from corporate executioner to the woman he had so callously betrayed. I addressed him directly, ensuring every person in that silent ballroom heard exactly what kind of monster he truly was. I reminded him of the brutal, freezing night I gave birth to our children. I repeated his exact cruel words back to him, letting them hang heavy in the elegant space. "You told me you had a pivotal meeting in the morning," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, calm whisper that echoed through the speakers. "You pulled the covers over your head and told me you needed your sleep. You told me to call a rideshare while I was bleeding and terrified because my medical emergency was an inconvenience to your ambition. You thought I was a burden. You effectively fired me from your life, believing I was a useless, weak desk worker who would simply quietly accept her ruin." Dominic's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face, but he found absolutely nothing. The venture capitalist stared at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The angel investors shook their heads in absolute disgust. Patricia and Brittany sat paralyzed in their seats, hiding their faces in shame, completely unable to defend the monster they had enabled. I raised the microphone one final time, preparing to deliver the ultimate fatal blow. I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away any remaining shred of his fabricated dignity. "As the primary legal stakeholder of your core intellectual property," I continued, my voice ringing with final, unyielding authority, "and as the lead evaluator advising the venture capital firms in this room, I am officially initiating the immediate liquidation of your corporate entity. You have absolutely nothing left to sell, Dominic. Your technology is mine. Your stolen funds are frozen. Your fraudulent empire is completely dead." I paused, letting the absolute finality of my words sink into his terrified brain. I offered him the very same cold, dismissive energy he had shown me in the darkest, most agonizing moment of my life. "You are officially fired from your own startup," I declared, finalizing his destruction. The reaction in the ballroom was instantaneous and devastating. The head of the lead venture capital firm stood up, disgusted and outraged by the blatant attempted fraud, and simply walked away from the stage. Following his lead, the entire room of wealthy investors immediately stood up en masse. They grabbed their expensive leather portfolios, turned their backs on the sweating, trembling man at the podium, and walked straight out the heavy mahogany doors. They did not offer a single word of consolation or negotiation. They marched out in a unified wave of corporate rejection, leaving Dominic standing utterly alone under the harsh, bright stage lights. The grand ballroom emptied rapidly, the sound of hundreds of footsteps echoing like a stampede fleeing a burning building. His reputation was entirely in ashes, his business completely obliterated, and his future permanently erased. The spotlight remained fixed on him, highlighting the exact moment his entire existence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I turned my back on the stage, handing the microphone back to the security detail, and walked calmly back to my seat in the VIP section, perfectly satisfied that justice had been flawlessly, mercilessly served. The echoing thud of the heavy doors slamming shut behind the fleeing investors sounded like the final gavel strike on Dominic. The grand ballroom, once overflowing with elite financial titans, now felt like a massive hollow cavern. The scent of expensive champagne hung thick in the air. Only a handful of people remained trapped in the wreckage of the night. Dominic stood completely frozen on the brightly lit stage, his perfectly tailored tuxedo now looking like a pathetic costume on a defeated imposter. His breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of his ruin finally crushed his arrogant delusions. Down in the front row, the carefully constructed illusion of high society superiority had completely violently evaporated for Patricia and Brittany. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law sat paralyzed in their velvet chairs. The smug, triumphant smiles they had worn all evening were entirely gone, replaced by slack-jawed horror. They stared at the massive projection screen, where the undeniable proof of his financial crimes still burned brightly. Their golden boy, the supposed solitary genius, who was destined to secure their billionaire status, had just been publicly unmasked as a desperate, desperate thief. The sheer magnitude of his public humiliation left them entirely speechless, unable to formulate a single excuse or hurl a single insult. But the most drastic immediate shift in loyalty came from the woman standing near the edge of the stage. Cameron had watched the entire corporate execution with widening, terrified eyes. She had attached herself to Dominic solely for the promise of private flights, designer wardrobes, and boundless wealth. She had eagerly played the role of the devoted co-founder when she thought he was a rising tech mogul holding a $20 million check. The moment I verbally incinerated his business model and proved his accounts were frozen, her supportive facade dropped like a heavy stone. She looked at the sweating, shaking man at the podium and realized he was not a ticket to luxury. He was an anchor tied to massive federal liabilities and mountains of fraudulent debt. Without a single word of comfort, Cameron turned on her expensive heels. Her survival instinct kicked in with ruthless clarity. She quietly slipped away from the main seating area, keeping to the heavy shadows along the perimeter of the ballroom. She headed toward the service corridors, intending to slip out the back exit and completely erase Dominic from her existence. She severely underestimated the scope of my retaliation. Cameron pushed through the swinging service doors and hurried down the brightly lit corridor leading toward the loading dock. She was furiously typing on her phone, likely trying to secure a rideshare or contact her next unsuspecting target. As she rounded the corner into the expansive rear lobby, her frantic escape route was abruptly, violently severed. 4 uniformed local police officers were waiting for her, standing squarely blocking the only exit. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He did not ask for her identification. My investigators had already provided them with a flawless dossier including her location and exact description. The officer loudly addressed Cameron by her full legal name, completely ignoring her sudden panicked protests. He informed her that they were executing an active arrest warrant issued just hours earlier by a municipal judge. He stated with absolute clinical authority that she was being formally charged with filing a malicious, fabricated, and highly dangerous report to Child Protective Services. Cameron's face drained of all color as the realization hit her. The anonymous tip she had weaponized against me, claiming I was a neglectful, psychotic mother, starving my newborn twins, had spectacularly backfired. The social worker had followed through on her promise, referring Cameron to law enforcement for wasting state resources to facilitate extortion. Cameron completely lost her composure. She shrieked loudly, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding and desperately trying to shift the entire blame onto Dominic. The officers remained entirely unmoved by her hysterical performance. 2 officers stepped forward, gripping her arms and spinning her around. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed sharply against the marble walls. Cameron began kicking and screaming wildly as the officers forcefully dragged her out the glass doors toward the waiting squad car. Her pathetic attempts to secure a luxurious life built on my pain ended with her being shoved into the back of a police cruiser, her reputation and freedom entirely dismantled. Back inside the cavernous ballroom, the final act of Dominic destruction was unfolding with terrifying precision. The silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of heavy tactical boots marching in perfect unison. The main mahogany doors burst wide open, hitting the walls with a resounding crash. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers bearing the stark gold letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation swarmed into the room. They moved with absolute unyielding authority. This was the devastating result of the irrefutable forensic evidence Terrence had compiled and that my legal team had submitted directly to the federal banking regulators. Dominic watched the agents marching down the center aisle. His knees physically gave out. He collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the stage, completely unable to support his own weight. He fell hard, his expensive microphone dropping and letting out a sharp screech of static before rolling away. He knelt there, a ruined, pathetic shadow of a man completely surrounded by the overwhelming digital evidence of his own insatiable greed. The lead federal agent bypassed the stairs and vaulted effortlessly onto the stage, marching directly toward Dominic. The agent did not offer a polite greeting. He stood over Dominic, looking down at him with pure professional disdain. His voice boomed across the empty ballroom, carrying a weight that completely shattered any remaining illusions Dominic harbored about talking his way out of this disaster. The agent formally advised Dominic that he was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He methodically listed the severe catastrophic charges against him, reading them aloud for his horrified family to hear: wire fraud, aggravated investor fraud, identity theft, and the criminal forgery of signatures on multiple massive secondary residential mortgages. Every single charge the agent listed carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The sheer gravity of his crimes had finally caught up to him. The agent reached down, grabbing Dominic roughly by the shoulder of his bespoke tuxedo and hauling him forcefully to his feet. Dominic did not fight back. He did not scream or protest his innocence. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, staring blankly ahead as the cold, heavy federal handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists, securing his hands behind his back. The absolute reality that his life as a free, wealthy tech founder was permanently, officially over had completely broken his mind. Down in the front row, Patricia and Brittany watched the scene unfold in a state of sheer paralyzed horror. Patricia clutched her chest, her mouth opening in a silent scream as she watched federal agents pat down her golden boy and confiscate his personal belongings. Brittany was visibly shaking her hands, covering her face completely, unable to process how their grand night of celebration had turned into a horrific, highly public criminal arrest. They had spent years enabling his toxic behavior, inflating his massive ego, and blindly supporting his cruel treatment of me. Now they were forced to sit there and watch helplessly, as the absolute consequences of their shared arrogance physically dragged him away to a federal holding cell. The agents marched Dominic down the center stairs of the stage and guided him up the main aisle, heading straight toward the exit. I stepped out from the protective wall of my security detail and walked calmly down the adjacent aisle, moving toward the main lobby. Our paths intersected briefly near the heavy mahogany doors. Dominic raised his head, his eyes locking onto mine for one final agonizing second. He looked entirely broken, entirely hollow, desperate for a single ounce of the mercy he had so ruthlessly denied me when I was bleeding and terrified. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I did not offer him a smug smile, a final biting insult, or even a single shred of acknowledgement. I looked right through him as if he were entirely beneath my notice. I strode effortlessly past Patricia and Brittany, who were sobbing openly. I did not spare them a single glance, stepping out into the crisp, cool night air. My blacked-out SUV was waiting at the curb with the powerful engine softly idling. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, settling into the quiet, secure space. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of absolute justice. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, smoothly carrying me far away from the wreckage, perfectly ready to embrace the dawn of my new unbreakable empire without them. 1 month passed since the catastrophic collapse of his fraudulent empire. The fallout was swift and absolute, sweeping through his entitled family with devastating precision. Patricia and Brittany found themselves completely consumed by the massive legal consequences of their unwavering loyalty to a criminal. Desperate to keep Dominic out of a federal penitentiary, they had foolishly leveraged their own homes, liquidating every remaining asset they possessed to afford aggressive defense attorneys. Their arrogant gamble failed spectacularly against the mountain of forensic evidence, and the high-priced lawyers quickly drained their accounts dry before abandoning the sinking ship. Completely bankrupt and facing imminent foreclosure on their sprawling suburban estates, the two women hit rock bottom. Stripped of their expensive designer clothes, their country club memberships, and their false sense of superiority, they arrived at the heavy iron gates of my newly acquired high-security property in the northern suburbs. The relentless, bitter winter wind whipped around them as they stood on the freezing sidewalk, presenting a stark, pathetic contrast to the arrogant royalty they had pretended to be just weeks prior. They leaned heavily against the cold stone pillars, weeping hysterically into the digital intercom system. They desperately begged me to drop the civil restitution charges, pleading for sudden financial mercy. and demanding I lend them enough capital to save them from impending absolute homelessness. They shamelessly tried to invoke family loyalty utilizing the very same toxic manipulative tactics they had used for years to excuse Dominic's abhorrent behavior. They sobbed into the microphones, spinning wild, pathetic narratives about how they were simply misled victims who had always truly loved me. I sat comfortably in the profound warmth of my expansive modern kitchen, holding a mug of dark roast coffee. I watched their pathetic, desperate display unfold in crystal clear, high definition through the security camera monitor mounted securely on the marble wall. There was no trace of sympathy anywhere in my chest. These were the exact same women who had invaded my sterile hospital recovery room, demanding I hand over my newborn son, and threatening to leave me utterly destitute. They had gleefully celebrated my supposed downfall and actively participated in the financial extortion that nearly ruined my entire life. They expected me to crumble under the heavy weight of their dramatic tears, playing the role of the submissive victim they had always assumed me to be. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse. I reached forward deliberately and pressed the silver intercom button, allowing the two-way audio to activate across the freezing driveway. I did not raise my voice to yell or offer a lengthy vindictive monologue about their impending ruin. I simply looked at their tear-stained, desperate faces on the glowing screen, took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, and coldly repeated the exact cruel words Dominic had used against me when I was bleeding and terrified. I told them I have an important meeting tomorrow and I need sleep. I released the button immediately and permanently cut the live audio and video feed, severing the connection. I turned my back on the monitor, leaving them stranded and weeping uncontrollably on the freezing street outside my impenetrable fortress, subjected to the brutal freezing elements they had once so casually condemned me to endure alone. The final family court hearing took place 2 weeks later, serving as the absolute ruthless legal execution of Dominic's parental rights. I sat at the polished plaintiff table, flanked by my team of corporate and family law attorneys, projecting total immaculate composure. Dominic did not appear in person. He was beamed into the austere wood-paneled courtroom via a heavily monitored video link broadcast directly from a highly secure federal holding facility. The tailored suits and arrogant smirks were completely gone. He wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit, his face pale, gaunt, and thoroughly defeated by his massive federal charges. The presiding judge, a stern, no-nonsense magistrate with absolutely zero tolerance for domestic financial manipulation, had exhaustively reviewed the towering mountain of forensic evidence we submitted. She looked at the digital display of Dominic, viewing his pathetic state with absolute disgust. The judge did not mince words when delivering her final brutal ruling. She systematically stripped him of all parental rights, determining that a man who would criminally forge secondary mortgages against his pregnant wife and abandon her during a life-threatening medical emergency possessed no moral or legal standing to ever raise children. She granted me sole legal and physical custody of the twins, ensuring he could never weaponize them against me or seek any form of visitation in the future. Furthermore, she addressed the massive financial damages resulting from his elaborate systemic fraud. The judge officially ordered the immediate total liquidation of all remaining assets belonging to Dominic and his complicit enabling family members. The funds generated from the forced sale of Patricia and Brittany foreclosed homes would be redirected to pay full restitution for the forged mortgages and the severe corporate damages he had inflicted. He was left with absolutely nothing: zero company equity, zero personal wealth, zero family support, and zero future prospects. The video link was terminated by the bailiff, cutting his horrified protests short and leaving him to face his lengthy federal sentence in complete darkness and isolation. 6 months flashed forward, erasing the last lingering shadows of the bitter winter and bringing the bright, sharp clarity of summer. The scene opened far away from the dark, chaotic hospitals and rented temporary office spaces of my painful past. I now operated from a sprawling, magnificent glass-walled corner office, located on the absolute highest floor of a towering skyscraper overlooking the breathtaking Manhattan skyline. The brilliant morning sun poured heavily through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine executive space. My beautiful, perfectly healthy twins were sitting comfortably on a plush geometric rug near my massive, solid mahogany desk, playing happily with a collection of brightly colored wooden blocks. They were thriving, growing rapidly, and completely insulated from the toxic manipulation and criminal chaos that had once threatened to consume their early lives. A polite professional knock sounded at the heavy glass door. Terrence walked into the expansive office, projecting a newfound sense of absolute confidence and immense professional power. Following his brutal, highly public divorce from Brittany and his instrumental role in uncovering Dominic's massive financial conspiracy, I had aggressively recruited him to join my empire. He was no longer the quiet, marginalized accountant suffering silently under the heavy weight of racist, classist in-laws who severely underestimated his brilliant mind. He was now the highly paid, fiercely respected chief financial officer of my rapidly expanding holding company. He wore a sharp, bespoke suit carrying a sleek leather portfolio that contained the final pieces of our executed corporate strategy. He had seamlessly transitioned from an unexpected ally in a hospital room to my most trusted and heavily compensated partner. Terrence offered a warm, genuine smile to the twins playing on the floor before stepping up to my polished desk. He opened the premium leather portfolio and silently handed me the very last stack of official certified legal documents. I scanned the crisp white pages, confirming the absolute permanent finality of the entire situation. They were the completed, irreversible bankruptcy filings for Dominic, Patricia, and Brittany. The federal government had successfully seized every single remaining physical and liquid asset they possessed, liquidating their entire fabricated empire to fulfill the massive restitution orders and cover their endlessly mounting legal penalties. The dangerous threat they once posed to my family and my highly successful career was now entirely neutralized. They had been permanently erased from the corporate and social maps, reduced to absolutely nothing but cautionary tales of extreme greed and fatal arrogance. I picked up my favorite heavy silver pen and signed the final acknowledgement document with a swift, decisive flourish. I handed the dark folder back to Terrence, sharing a look of profound mutual respect and silent absolute victory. He nodded respectfully and exited the bright corner office, leaving me entirely alone with my two wonderful children. I stood up from my leather executive chair and walked slowly over to the towering glass windows. I looked out over the sprawling, magnificent financial empire I had aggressively acquired and brilliantly consolidated. The bustling, energetic city moved rapidly far below me, completely unaware of the brutal, quiet war that had been waged and decisively won. I took a deep, calming breath, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace. I had taken the darkest, most agonizing night of my entire life, a terrible night where I was abandoned, bleeding, and terrified in a blizzard, and I had weaponized that profound pain to forge an absolute masterpiece of corporate revenge. I had systematically destroyed the selfish monsters who desperately tried to break me, and in their empty place, I had built an unbreakable kingdom for myself and my children.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain through every triumph